the same inspiration from John Gardner. He had formed Common Cause, stood for all good things. And the last time I spoke here, like Walter and his wife, I was in love with a woman for about 40-some years, Trish Hooper, who was here. And after failing to get her to divorce her husband, she caused me to marry the second best woman in the world, Helen. I was, Trish and I spoke together that time, but you may remember Helen. I remember in 2004, my family, which had been Republican since the year before Lincoln in California, I spoke to a group that included the mayors of every city in the peninsula, all Republicans, and we formed a group called Republicans for Kerry, because we were so worried about what might happen if more justices were appointed. Well, I forgot to mention that in a garden down in Palo Alto, there were 300 people raving and cheering, and all Republicans who had decided that they couldn't stand what Bush stood for, the junior. And I stepped down, and my wife stepped up. She said, "Pete forgot one thing." She said, "The main thing about this election, if this guy is reelected, we're liable to have another member of the Supreme Court who will take all women's rights away from them," which was the major point of the whole deal. Now, we lost that election. And the Supreme Court today, and I have to tell you that of all the causes that exist, the people that are now running the Republican Party, the party that I have left, believe that wealthy people are best suited to run the country. The Supreme Court and the group that respects them go back to the Constitution when you had to own property to vote, and when senators were selected to be the main part of the Congress of the United States. And they believe that we should go back to that, and that the country is better off if rich people are taxed less, run the country through contributions. And I want to give you just one example. Some years ago, I was offended by the Vietnam War, and I went to New Hampshire to take on President Nixon solely on the issue of the war. And men and women came forward. The mayor of Concord, who had been shot down at the end of World War II, and his wife, who later became the Speaker of the New Hampshire legislature, and their daughter, who was 16. And they worked in that campaign, and years later, the daughter came to Washington and worked in my last 3 years. Her name was Annie McLean. The McLean family in New Hampshire goes back, the 400 McLeans, it goes back to Revolutionary times, all Republicans. Well, Annie McLean, last year, 2010, 2 years ago, ran against a 6-term Republican incumbent in a year when Republicans, if you'll recall, swept off the Democratic majority that existed barely for 2 years. Raised $1 million. Annie raised $1 million, had people all over New Hampshire. A lot of us went there to work for her. There were 206,000 votes cast, and she lost by 1,500, less than 1%, against a 6-term Republican incumbent. Annie's running again, and I'll go to New Hampshire, and Helen will go to New Hampshire, and we'll try to help her, because she represents really the test of good and evil, and here's why. Her opponent, the 6-term incumbent, just received $100,000 from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. That's how they care, how much they care about defeating a person of her frame of reference. If that happens all over the country, if big money comes in, and with 100 seats in the House in session in any given year, you can imagine what $1 million, if the Koch brothers decide to throw in $1 million in against Annie McLean Custer, can she win? And she can only win if people come forward to help her. Of her contributions, she got a little over $1 million thus far. 95% of it come from individuals. 75% of his money comes from big corporations, including this last $100,000. So what we're up against in this particular issue that Linda has spoken about, and all of us feel deeply about, of making it plain that some people are getting all of the money from these corporate sources and others are getting it from individuals. And I think given that information, the public will generally make the proper choice that they prefer not to be run by Standard Oil or whatever corporation or Chamber of Commerce. I'm ashamed of the Chamber of Commerce. I don't know where the San Mateo County Chamber of Commerce stands, but I'm going to speak to, we're lucky we have 2 of the finest Congress people in the world. The world is a lot more honest since we started electing women to Congress. And, you can't find any better than Jackie Speier or Anna Eshoo But in any event, I looked around tonight, and I know you all feel as I do, that if we're privileged to sit here and look out there and see the bay and go up in the ridge and look out and see the Pacific, if you're privileged to live here, we owe a duty to give something back, to give more back, because we're privileged to live here. And this issue is worth doing, so thanks for coming. And let me just introduce the woman who is really speaking for me. This is my wife, Helen, Trish Hooper's daughter, because she's probably remembered something I forgot. Helen, do you want to say anything?
Hey, John. Hi, everybody. He didn't forget anything except to say something my grandfather said to me years ago. He said, there's no such thing as business between friends. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, if you lend money to friends or a friend, you should always memorialize that agreement, because you don't want your friendship to be tainted by the vagaries of time or circumstance. And he concluded by saying, and anyway, anybody who's honest will never have a problem putting their name to a document that they believe in or that they've agreed to. And I've often thought about that, and I think about it now in terms of this California Clean Money Initiative campaign, because there's such a disingenuine aspect to what's going on in politics in this country, and we're moving so quickly to being a third world nation on so many fronts, and the almost ruthlessness with which this is all happening really demands that we fight back. And I think this bill and this effort and initiatives that are like this are the key thing to support. We're moving towards the 14th century. There's a bumper sticker that said the Republicans are moving us forward to the 14th century, and what they're doing to women and even contraception is so mind-boggling that you almost wake up wondering what drug you took the night before, and this isn't really happening. But in any event, thank you all for being here. I also have to remember, there's a famous saying, I don't have it quite right, but it basically goes like this, and we have to remember this, because it's hard to keep fighting these battles, but it's so worthwhile. It's so much more worthwhile than doing nothing. And that is, first they mock you, then they hate you, then they fight you, and then you win.
You've just heard from the only woman in the world that would move to Lodi for 5 months to take out Richard Pombo, Chairman, House Resources Committee.
Well,